Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome our friend Jonathan Rauch back to the show. John is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, contributing editor of National Journal and The Atlantic, and recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award. His half-dozen books include Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, and Gay Marriage, Why It's Good for Gays, Good for Straights, and Good for America. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Bill. Thank you.
It's nice to have you back. I've always enjoyed our chats. Jonathan, I ask you on because you're a proud Yale alumnus, a college quite well known for its inclusive environment when it comes to gay students and minorities. What's going on there?
Well, a couple things are happening at once. One is that some minority students believe that they're not being sufficiently welcomed on the campus and that there's too much of a kind of sense that they're outsiders, that they constantly have to explain themselves to other people. And I've talked to folks at Yale and people who've graduated from other colleges recently who say that's true and that it's a real and ongoing problem. But there's a second thing that also happened, which is happening not just at Yale but a lot of places, which is that a lot of students are saying, we have a right to be comfortable. Our academic community, our environment here is our home. And like our home, it should make us feel at ease. It should be welcoming at all times. And that's led to a kind of outburst of, there was a confrontation on campus that began with a Halloween costume situation, which I could tell you about if you have a minute.
Yeah, please, because some of our listeners may not be aware of that whole fracas.
Every year at a lot of universities, there's issues about Halloween costumes and try to make them not offensive. And of course, it's good to have not offensive Halloween costumes. At Yale this past year, a faculty member named Erica Christakis sent out an email, a very thoughtful, very carefully worded, reasonable email that kind of asked members of the Yale community, particularly a subset called Silliman College, do we really want faculty and administration at Yale sort of holding our hands about Halloween costumes, and wouldn't it be better if we see an offensive costume to actually tell the person that's offensive and why and try to educate them rather than having sort of people policing Halloween costumes? Well, that led to an uproar because a lot of students thought it was diminishing the offensiveness of some of these costumes, and that in turn led to a confrontation in the Silliman College courtyard between a student and the master.
Yeah, I saw the video.
Yeah, it's a pretty striking video. The master of Silliman College basically, it's like a dorm, a big dorm, and he runs it. And he's surrounded by students, and one of the students begins having a meltdown and yells at him in language that I can't repeat on a radio show to the effect that this place is not about creating an intellectual environment. It's supposed to be my home. It's supposed to be comfortable. You're not doing your effing job. Who the F hired you?
To what extent have our colleges become finishing schools rather than rigorous educational programs designed to stimulate intellectual growth?
Well, there's some of both, and of course they always have been. But what's happened now that's new is a kind of more ideological movement that says colleges should be comfortable at all times. There's always going to be a tension, Bill, because, of course, especially at a place like Yale, these students and their parents are paying through the nose to be there. They're the customers, right? And the schools often market themselves as very happy places, comfortable places. Yale markets its residential colleges, of which Silliman is one, as little paradises. So students and parents are not being told, look, you're coming here for an environment that's going to be a robust intellectual exchange where feelings are inevitably going to get hurt. They're being told, come here and have, a Disney cruise. And it's a competitive environment. So that's what a lot of places are doing. And the trouble with that, of course, is that in an educational environment where you're really trying to learn, you're going to have a conflict of values and a conflict of ideas, and you're going to have to confront people quite frequently who have strongly disagreeing views. And if you walk in the door with the mentality that you're entitled to be comfortable, well, your educational experience is not going to be as good.
How much blame must we baby boomers take for raising kids with such fragile self-images that they feel they need to be protected from ideas?
Well, you hit one of my kind of soft points there because I'm a late baby boomer, but I identify with millennials. I was born in 1960, right at the end. And I'm not a big fan of the baby boom generation. But yeah, I think that there's something to that. When I talk to people about this, a lot of them say, well, parents of my generation have spared no effort to make their kids feel comfortable at all times and happy at all times.
Right. No bullies, no confrontation, everybody gets a blue ribbon.
Yeah, the kind of free-range childhood that I grew up with, which clearly had its disadvantages, certainly did in my case, is kind of out of fashion. So there's a sense in which it's arguably an extension of this child-rearing philosophy that says, well, if you're entitled to be comfortable all the time or most of the time growing up in your own home, then you move to college and that's your new home, and you're entitled to be comfortable there too. So there may be an element of that. Yet there's also an ideological element, this sense that it's really wrong for people to be exposed to stuff that makes them extremely unhappy, that it's a form of oppression. It's called microaggressions in many cases. A microaggression is a new term for a very small, unintentional way of giving offense. And, this could be as simple as explaining something to someone who already understands it and who then perceives that as patronizing. So there's a kind of ideological element of, well, speech policing is a bit too strong, but it kind of goes in that direction.
With very few exceptions, college administrators have been falling all over themselves to give in to student demands, some pretty extreme. What makes these people so craven?
There's a couple things there. One is that there's kind of only one side to this equation. There's not much of a strong constituency for free speech on a lot of these campuses. Some of the alumni will stand up for it, and some outside groups will, but a lot of the students at a place like Yale actually don't agree with the demands for action against microaggressions, and they actually want the more confrontational intellectual environment, but they tend to keep their heads down. I've talked to a few students, one former recent Yale graduate and some others from some other places, and they say, well, yeah, we think a lot of students just don't agree with this, but they don't want to get in the target zone either, so they kind of keep their head down. And another is the dilemma that administrators find themselves in, because their job is to keep the place kind of quiet and peaceful. And then there's a third thing, which the pattern you see, this is not just Yale, we've seen outbreaks of this kind at Claremont McKenna. There's one in Kansas just the other day. That one was, to me, the most disturbing because it involved graduate students, not undergraduates. These are adults in their 20s. There's no issue with in loco parentis there. These are not kids in any sense of the word. They've chosen to be there as adults, and they're still saying we should not be exposed to stuff we don't like in class. They called for the firing of a communications professor who used the N-word in class in a conversation about media handling of racism. And that conflict is going on. So what we know from years of literature by political scientists is what bureaucracies maximize as bureaucrats. And there's a tendency in bureaucracies when confronted with this, what they do is say, well, we'll hire more people to deal with it. We'll have new assistant deans, we'll have new programs, we'll have some professors that are going to specifically think about minority issues, and that's what's happening at Yale. So there's also that kind of element going on as well.
And there's a flood of money backing that up, particularly with all the willingness of the federal government to give students loans to pay these outrageous tuitions.
Well, you mentioned the federal government, and that is an issue. The Obama administration's education department has put a pretty heavy thumb on the scales of be careful about anything that could look like harassment of minorities, and they've defined that term very broadly. So a lot of universities, there are people there who would like to do more about free speech, but they're worried about getting in trouble with the administration, so they kind of keep their head down. They worry about losing federal funding, for example. So that's another kind of accelerant to this trend, I think.
So, Jonathan, the Black Lives Matter movement figures prominently in this current wave of campus unrest. How did a movement that started out focused on police brutality pivot into demands for more black professors and larger affirmative action set-asides for minorities?
You know, I see them as separate to some extent. I think the post-Ferguson environment clearly is one that has racially charged issues in a lot of ways. But Black Lives Matter is a whole lot of different things. And a lot of it is, I think, very legitimate and very important conversation about use of police tactics and the way those have been targeted and used over the years. But I think it has just heightened sensitivity on campuses. So there's kind of less of a margin of error. But I think it's only one of a lot of things going on. People I've talked to who know a lot more about the academic world than I do have said it really began about 2 years ago. You saw a real wave of increased consciousness of this idea that people need to be comfortable and that microaggressions are a problem. And we're not sure why, but social media may have something to do with that, for example.
What role has Barack Obama played in inflaming racial tensions, and what responsibility does he have to try and quiet things down?
I don't think he's played a role in inflaming racial tensions, and I don't think he has any responsibility to quiet things down. I don't particularly see him as a big player in this, one way or the other.
You mentioned earlier, though, that his education department has weighed in pretty heavily on the campus.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And I think it would be better policy if the administration backed off on that and put a higher premium on free speech. But I think that's something that's happening deeper in the administration. I don't think that's a White House kind of decision.
Okay. Well, college faculty are well known to skew further left than the general population, yet there are a few conservative black professors not afraid to speak out. One of them, a Professor Carol Swain at Vanderbilt University, has been under furious attack for taking politically incorrect positions. What can conservative faculty do to protect themselves from irate student mobs?
Well, first of all, let's think about irate student mobs. A point that we've got to make here is, to a large extent, what a lot of these students are doing is protesting. And I wouldn't equate a peaceful protest with an irate student mob. I think that's also a mistake. I'm a real partisan of free speech, and that, of course, includes the right of people to get angry at administrators and universities and to civilly and peacefully but firmly protest that. So what I'm criticizing is some of the ideas behind the protest, and at Yale, of course, we saw that confrontation become very uncivil. But I think that one thing is that conservative faculty members should not think about every protest as an angry student mob. I think that's an overreaction in the other direction. That said, I think a very important thing that's happened out there is the introduction of the group Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is providing support to faculty members, both conservative and liberal, but anyone who runs into trouble or free speech problems in any case as a result of their views on campus. And that's been one important resource. There's also the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, which is providing support. I think if you're an isolated faculty member and you come under fire and it seems like everyone is against you and the partisans of free speech are not going to speak up, I think if you're isolated, it actually is quite hard to fight back or struggle. But I admire people who, like Nicholas Christakis, who is the master of Silliman, stood in that courtyard and very rationally and civilly stood his ground and made his argument. And I think, as difficult as that may be, that's what needs to happen.
Speaking of protests that get out of hand, I personally don't know anyone under 30 who would even dream of shouting a racial epithet. Why would some black students at Dartmouth think it's acceptable to barge into a library, literally pin students against the wall, and shout things like "F you, you filthy white Fs," all captured on video?
I am not acquainted with that case.
You should look into that one. It's pretty frightening.
Generically, campuses have been, since the 60s, places where some pretty nasty protests happen. There's nothing new about this. And fortunately, most people on most campuses want to have a fairly civil lifestyle and don't agree with that sort of thing. So I wouldn't hit the panic button in each particular case. What I keep coming back to, Bill, in the case of Yale and some of these other places, is not that it's just some students getting upset and having a protest which turns uncivil. That is always going to happen in universities around the world until the end of time. That's how it is with university life. What I come back to is the idea behind the protest, which is that people in an academic environment, whether students or faculty or anyone else, are entitled to intellectual safety all the time. That idea is antithetical to the mission of the university. And to the extent it takes root, the problem there isn't that a protest happens now and then, or that somebody does something, that's really asinine. The problem there is that it seeps out into the general values of the university, so that the nice people who are trying to do the right thing become afraid of having a robust conversation. And then, of course, everyone suffers from that, because the educational process is a process that exposes our innermost beliefs and values to questions, often in offensive ways. When I was a Yale undergraduate, I was a freshman in a class on political theory, a small class with a professor. And the professor really pushed us one day on saying, what can you really be certain of? Tell me one thing you can really be sure of. And one student said, well, it's certain that we're all going to die. The professor said, well, how do you know that, Miss So-and-so? And the student said, well, everyone's always died. He said, well, how do you know everyone will always die in the future? How do you know you'll die just because everyone has died before you? This is, of course, the
classic
thinking of David Hume, the famous skeptical scholar of the 18th century. And it's very upsetting, actually, when you're confronted with it. And that student began to cry in that class, which I watched with very mixed feelings, because on the one hand, I felt sorry for her, and it's kind of startling to be 18 and exposed to these ideas. But on the other hand, that's what happens when you hit really painful ideas for the first time. The idea that you can't be certain of anything, absolutely nothing. Think about how upsetting and how subversive that is. So you want an environment where, yes, people get support, but in a context where people understand that the exchange of ideas is going to be robust, and minorities and majorities alike are going to hear things that they don't like.
Looking at the current unrest, a recent analysis in the American Spectator asks and answers the question, why are some of the most privileged students in the nation plunging into a racial grievance culture? The article suggests that large admissions preferences given to minorities have pushed them into colleges that are over their heads. This can lead to poor performance, weak self-esteem, poor assimilation into campus culture, and the narrative that their problems are caused by racial oppression. What do you make of that line of thought?
Yeah, I just don't really know enough about the facts of that in, for example, the Yale case, which is the one I've looked at. Yale is at the very, very top of the heap for universities. And my guess is that if there's one place where the mismatch thesis does not apply, it would be there, because they get the absolute best regardless of minority status or majority status or anything else. The mismatch thesis is that because of affirmative action at most levels of education, you've got minority students going to universities where they're not fully competitive, and that creates backlash and unhappiness of various ways.
John, what do you make of efforts to rewrite history, expunging honored leaders of the past because they don't measure up to contemporary standards? As a gay man and a longtime advocate of marriage equality, a battle that's nearly won, do you feel oppressed by bigots from the past?
Do I feel oppressed by bigots from the past? That's an interesting question that I've never, ever been asked before, Bill, because I spent my career being oppressed by bigots in the present.
That's why I asked you on the show.
They were well-intentioned, often well-intentioned people who had no idea what they were doing or why it was wrong, though not in every case. You're talking to someone who just the other month in Atlantic Monthly called for the name of J. Edgar Hoover to be removed from the FBI building in Washington, D.C. So you're talking to someone who does believe that there are cases where history shows that somebody who we thought was a good guy was not, and that honoring that person sends a very bad message in the modern age. So I'm not someone who's going to say it's always wrong to take someone's name off a building. I'm perfectly comfortable with Yale taking John C. Calhoun's name off Calhoun College, for example. Calhoun was not a good man. He advocated really horrible racist ideas and played a major role in deliberately fracturing the United States. So I'm perfectly happy for that debate to happen, actually. And in many ways, having a debate about Woodrow Wilson at Princeton and whether his name belongs on various important things, the School of Government at Princeton, I kind of welcome that debate, actually. I think it's inevitable in a society with evolving values that over time you're going to reassess the past in light of modern values. And as long as you do that in an intelligent way, then I'm all for it, actually. I don't know how I feel about the Wilson School. It's a private institution, so it's not like the FBI building, which is kind of the seat of federal law enforcement. You send a very powerful message when the seat of federal law enforcement is named for the man who illegally harassed Martin Luther King, attempted to essentially blackmail him, and who developed files on tens of thousands of homosexuals and attempted to get them fired and used that to essentially blackmail the President of the United States. One could go on and on with Hoover.
He's a notorious character. I certainly remember celebrating his death day when I was in college.
Yeah. A place like Princeton, though, it's a private institution. I think it's fully within its rights to have this argument about Woodrow Wilson, who's a very mixed character. I'm guessing that there are a lot of listeners to this show who are libertarians, who probably feel pretty strongly that Wilson was a president who did more than almost anyone else to establish a very large state.
Yep.
So I kind of welcome that conversation, personally.
Let the debate begin.
It's interesting the way you phrased the question was, should bigots of the past, do they
oppress you,
offend me, or hurt me in the present?
Jonathan, you are so refreshingly intellectually consistent, and it's why I love having you on the show. You're going to have to come back again in the future. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you, Bill.
That was Jonathan Rauch from the Brookings Institution here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.